All right, hello, I'm Jack Hansen, and I will be presenting on Ron Eierman's Harvey Milk and the Trauma of Assassination. We're going to go through the context of San Francisco in the late 70s. We're going to talk about Harvey Milk, George Moscone, and Dan Weitz, the three players in this story. We're going to talk about the assassinations themselves. We're going to talk about the trial and the reactions of different groups in San Francisco. And finally, we're going to talk about cultural trauma, which is Eierman's focus of this piece. The research he conducted will not be my focus because this is a class about assassinations. So, San Francisco in the late 70s was changing rapidly. It sort of was riding the high of the summer of love and the hippie movement, but it was clear that this was not a sustainable way for a city to, for the culture of a city to, exist. So there were some structural changes that were going on that sort of coincided with the summer of love, but were not caused by it. There was a turnover from an industrial base. San Francisco was a port city traditionally, but as a result of ports moving elsewhere, and particularly to Oakland and other places in the Bay Area, the port was drying up, and in its place was a service economy and a tourist economy. And these changing demographics this changing economy led to changing demographics, which was a large immigrant Asian population and a large gay population that moved into what was becoming a very liberal city. These new arrivals were really well educated, and they moved into traditionally working class neighborhoods. Most of them had post-secondary degrees, and most of them were working in well-paying jobs, but because of the housing market, they had to settle in these neighborhoods that were traditionally occupied by sort of Irish and Italian families, and this led to a lot of tension in San Francisco. These new arrivals were a large progressive force that elected Mayor Moscone, who was one of the most progressive candidates to ever run in the city of San Francisco. He appointed a very liberal police chief, which angered the police force. And he also appointed several women of color and, I believe, a trans person and a couple of gay politicians to different positions within the city politics. And this was a first across the board. It was a very new thing for many of the constituents. But these were well-qualified people who helped to drive San Francisco in a much more progressive direction. Then, in 1977, a key election occurred right after some redistricting occurred. And this elected both Dan White and Harvey Milk as supervisors on the Board of Supervisors, representing the 8th and 5th districts, respectively. We'll talk about which those districts are in a second here. Oh, yeah, all right. So this is San Francisco. We've got the 5th district in red. That's Harvey Milk's district. It includes the Castro and Noe Valley, which are today even largely gay neighborhoods and largely young, educated people. But back then, particularly, would have been a new influx of gay people moving into the Castro. So this was a new district. It didn't exist in 1976. And Harvey Milk was the first person to ever serve as the supervisor of this district. Then we have Dan White, representing the 8th district, which is Visitation Valley. It is a large working-class neighborhood that back in the early 70s would have been primarily an Irish neighborhood, but today is probably more than 90% Hispanic. At that time, it was still undergoing the changes. And Dan White was sort of elected as the, supporter of the old way of the neighborhood. Harvey Milk was born in New York. He served in the Navy during the Korean War. He moved to San Francisco during the Summer of Love, where he ran for supervisor twice unsuccessfully as a hippie candidate. Picture him with long hair and really dingy clothes. And then in 1977, after sort of growing up a little and consulting with a political firm, he changed his image, dressing like the picture on the right. And his platform was appealing to young, educated gay men, sort of more through his identity than his politics, but then also appealing to small business because he was fiscally conservative. And he supported minority rights and small businesses and was very outgoing, and won the election with a healthy margin. George Moscone was considered a local hero because of his athletics. He was also a veteran. He served in the state senate for a couple of years with a focus on minority rights, and then he shifted his focus to San Francisco politics and ran for mayor. He had some weird connections to the People's Temple. That was Jim Jones's group. They helped him get elected. Jim Jones had his followers campaigning for Moscone. And in the week leading up to the assassinations, the Kool-Aid incident happened. So this was some weird ties to Moscone. He was hated by the police in particular, who hated him because he turned the city over to them. That's a Gorney quote from a piece written in 1984 that Eierman quotes several times throughout his article. The them in this case is gays and minorities he's referring to, talking about the demographic shift. Dan White was born to a firefighter family in the suburbs. He was a star athlete in high school and served in the Army. After the Army, he joined the police, but then he quit to become a firefighter following an incident where one of his fellow police officers beat up a prisoner. He was, at that time, a very moral man and a family man, and publicly disavowed his fellow police officers abusing their power. In 1977, he campaigned as a conservative Democrat, sort of focusing on restoring the traditional ways of life to his neighborhood. This made him wildly popular with the old Irish population. And cementing his popularity, he saved a woman from a burning building while giving an interview live on camera. And this sort of cemented him as a hero, and he won the election in a landslide. And following his return from prison after he served his time for killing Moscone and Milk, he found himself in the position of being one of the nation's most hated men, and he killed himself shortly thereafter. So we're going to talk about the assassinations themselves on the day of Monday, November 27th, 1978. In the week leading up to that, Dan White got in a fight with Milk and Moscone over a proposed rehab clinic, and he resigned his board seat in kind of a huff. Was really not happy with the way things were going. But and as he kind of stewed at home, he was visited by the police and the fire unions, who were his main donors, and they put a ton of pressure on him to go beg Moscone for his seat back. This sort of started the cycle of Eierman will argue emasculating him. It's unclear how much that is actually true, but he felt in a very uncomfortable position asking the mayor, who he hated, for his job back. And Moscone initially told him yes, but he secretly planned on appointing someone else to the board seat. And this was the move that would piss Dan White off enough to commit the assassinations. So, on Monday, he shows up to City Hall, sneaks through a basement window to avoid the metal detector. He walks up to Mayor Moscone's office and asks to speak to him. He then murders Moscone with 5 shots from his service revolver. Then he walks down the hall and invites Harvey Milk into White's old office that he had recently occupied, like a week earlier. They have some tense words, and then White kills Milk as well. He then leaves City Hall, drives to a diner. He borrows a car from one of his old colleagues, an aide that worked in his office, drives to a diner, and turns himself in to his former colleagues a few hours later. And his confession he'll give to his former best friend on the police force. This is the headline, the day after the assassinations. So this is the trial of Dan White, one of the most famous trials in history, maybe second to OJ for murder trials that were publicized as heavily as this was. Dan White confessed to the murders right off the bat, so this wasn't a trial about whether or not he did it. It was purely focused on the motive, and therefore, was it premeditated murder or was it manslaughter? The prosecution arguing premeditated murder because he snuck in, he had his pistol ready, Yeah, stuff like that. And he apparently had told people beforehand that he was going to murder people. This was a contentious point in the trial. The defense, on the other hand, argued that this was a man that was pushed to snap by the actions of Milk and Moscone, and that he just wanted revenge. He didn't show up to City Hall with the intention of killing them, but he did it in a sort of heat of the moment. In addition, the defense used the Twinkie defense, which has become a very popular legal joke, kind of, because they argued that a high intake of junk food resulted in Dan White's diminished mental capacity because he was eating so much junk food following resigning his job. But the main turning point of this case was that the jury that was chosen was very sympathetic to Dan White because during jury selection, anyone that expressed any not overtly anti-gay sentiment, anyone that was even ambivalent towards gay people, was disqualified. And this was sort of symptomatic of the prevailing attitude towards gay people in the 70s, which was that it was sort of anomalous and that anyone that supported them couldn't be considered for jury service. And as a result of this really sympathetic jury and Dan White putting on the waterworks in court, he was sentenced to 7 years and 8 months in prison for voluntary manslaughter. Let's talk about some of the reactions to this. So on the day of, as soon as the radio announced that Moscone and Milk were killed, the police station erupted into cheers. This is how hated Moscone and Milk were to the police. On the night of the murders, there was a huge candlelit vigil, the largest one up to that point in history. And it was a very peaceful incident. And this is in stark contrast to the night of the verdict, which is known as the White Night, when a huge percentage of San Francisco's gay population, and mostly just young people that were pissed off, took to the streets, burned police cars, and this is them breaking the front doors of City Hall. They would throw in Molotov cocktails and set City Hall on fire after that. So the media was a huge component in this case because of their representations of the three players. Harvey Milk was never just represented as Harvey Milk. He was always called the gay politician in the news. It was always Harvey Milk, the gay politician from San Francisco. And George Moscone was always the liberal mayor, and they hinted at his infidelity. This is not confirmed, but even though he had sort of a public persona as a family man, it is suggested, and was suggested even in major publications, that he was not faithful to his wife, which has no bearing on the case at all, but sort of helped demonize him in the media. In contrast to them, Dan White was always Dan White, family man, or Dan White, ex-firefighter. And they were always talking about him as a representative of old San Francisco and the old ways of life and old tradition and all that. And his treatment in the media really helped, turn the tide of this case and help the whole city begin to, if you were on the more conservative side of things, see Dan White as just a angry man that snapped due to the demographic shift or whatever. And it really had the effect of pissing off the gay population, who obviously took to the streets in the White Night riots and would take to the streets several more times in several more nights of rioting throughout the sort of long, drawn-out ordeal that was his imprisonment and different things coming out in the news. And the media coverage of this case never stopped, which we'll discuss a little, the causes of it never stopping later. But this was a huge, this was the story in San Francisco. So now we get into some sort of murky territory, because Ron Eierman, I don't know if people remember, but we read an Eierman piece before, and it was laden with sociological details that are really hard to figure out. This piece is as well. He uses the framework of a social drama, which he defines as variations from the established norms that play out publicly. That's a very vague definition, but essentially he argues that the drama of this case is due to Dan White violating the established norms of San Francisco in a very public manner, and that caused a drama that sort of was a black hole that enveloped the whole city in this drama. But the tangible results of this are that Milk became a martyr for the gay community. Even though he was not overtly representing gay interests, he was not elected as a candidate from a gay party or anything. His death and the fact that he was gay turned him into sort of the patron saint of the gay community. They actually call him Saint Harvey. There's a church of Saint Harvey in San Francisco. Moscone's death, Eiermann argues, was not important because of his identity, was only important because he was the mayor, and the fact that Moscone's death has sort of melted away into the background has helped bring out Milk's role in it and sort of diminishes Moscone's role, even though at the time he was by far the more famous of the two. Eiermann makes some weird arguments about Milk not being motivated by homophobia. He believes that White was motivated by revenge and sort of the pressures of changing San Francisco. This is a very contentious point, and you won't find a lot of agreement with that point in other media. However, it is clear that the light punishment, the voluntary manslaughter charge, was seen by many as the state sanctioning the killing of gay people. An aide of the Milk office was live on the radio at the time that the verdict came out, and he said, quote, "Oh, so it's okay to kill," and he used a slur there, "people now." And that was a really inciting incident that set off the White Night riots. And finally, the deaths really solidified the gay community. The gay community was not super cohesive in the late 70s. They voted not as a bloc, and was very much not a politicized identity. However, after the assassinations, it was a sign that the community as a whole was unsafe unless they really solidified, voted as one, and fought for their rights. And that sort of led to the modern gay voting bloc, the gay vote that is referred to in politics. Started in San Francisco and would spread throughout the U.S. So some conclusions from this. Eiermann says that it caused a tear in a fragile social fabric. I think that's fairly self-evident, but that's his main takeaway from this. It built a lot of outrage, and it caused the breach of social norms, that's that social drama that I discussed briefly, to continue for months and years. And for the gay community, it was proof of core anti-gay values of society. This is the keystone part. This was overt proof to gay people that society was sort of constructed in a way that was antithetical to their existence, and that could not, that their existence was sort of a threat to the establishment, and as such, they had to behave as if they were in a war. But as time fades on and the more gruesome details of the assassination fade away, it really just serves that Harvey Milk is an inspiration to many, and his legacy lives on in cultural memory as well as physical memory. This is the Sean Penn Milk document, or biopic, something like that, that won a couple Oscars, I believe. There's the Harvey Milk Cultural Center is the main gay cultural center in San Francisco. Anyways, the point is his legacy lives on, and Dan White and George Moscone have faded into the background. That's all I've got. Thank you for listening. Bye.